My name is William Holwick. It's July 26, 2026. This is my UNE biochemistry final project. All right, so did you know that our bodies require metal to operate smoothly? Unlike robots, who they're entirely made of metal and obviously some other materials, we only need a minute level of metals to metabolically function at the cellular level. It is such a small amount of these metals that it only takes up less than 1% of our entire body mass. The rest of our mass is comprised of organic elements like oxygen and carbon, hydrogen, sulfur, and lots of phosphate. The metabolic elements that are used inside of us are called transition metals. So let's dive deep into understanding these metabolic roles in our lives. I'm really excited to take this adventure with you through this wondrous land of metals. So let's get started. So throughout this video lecture, we have some objectives that I would like to cover. And we're going to explain why essential transition metals are classified as micronutrients, define complexation, and illustrate how the body uses molecules to safely sequester metal ions. Explain the importance of multivalency in transition metals. Describe the fundamental differences between aprotic acids and protic acids within the biological system. Describe the biological multifunctional roles of metals. Illustrate the gastrointestinal absorption pathways, and understand the conditions and clinical treatments for medical toxicity. When you think of micronutrients, you're probably not really thinking of metals, but the reality is that our biological systems don't only require vitamins such as vitamin C and vitamin B, but they also require a delicate balance of transition metals from our foods. These micronutrients can come from grains and legumes, potatoes, and they even come from our water. So you can expect to absorb metals such as iron, zinc, copper, manganese through all of these sources. So transition metals can be found within columns 3 to 11 on the periodic table, as seen here on this slide. You can see copper, which is the abbreviation Cu, iron, and Fe, manganese, Mn, and zinc, Zn. Those are very common transition metals that we will also be discussing later on. So remember when I said minute levels? Well, when we absorb excessive amounts, it can be toxic and cause disruption within our bodies. For instance, excessive amounts of manganese from well water can cause memory problems. My parents actually have a well, and they were experiencing all kinds of memory problems, and they were suspecting that it maybe was dementia. Their doctor had them test their water, and it turned out they had elevated levels of manganese, and the symptoms resolved once they were able to mitigate that. So it has really some real potential effects within these transition metals. You can also overdose on iron supplements, and that ultimately leads to widespread organ failure. So the symptoms aren't only just minor, they can have catastrophic effects. So some transition metals also fall into a separate element category considered heavy metals. And so some of these metals, such as zinc, are key players in enzyme electron transport protein functions like zinc finger motifs and DNA binding. These are metals that differ from the others because they have higher densities and are defined by their atomic weight instead of their electron structure. So metallic elements with densities greater than 5 grams per cubic centimeter or having atomic numbers greater than 20 are generally considered heavy. And many of these density metals can quickly cause chaos within our cellular metabolism. So some well-known examples of heavy metals include arsenic, lead, mercury, and cadmium. So have you ever heard of lead poisoning from paint chips, mercury toxicity from broken thermometers, even arsenic poisoning from contaminated water sources? Even though these many heavy metals play little to no roles in our body homeostasis, some including iron and copper, have huge roles to play and therefore require systems in place to ensure that they behave appropriately. So transition metals, when they're allowed to roam free within our bloodstream, they can cause harmful reactive oxygen species, also known as free radicals. And it reminds me of New Hampshire. Our slogan is live free or die, but we don't want that here because it really causes a lot of bad things. These free radicals have unpaired electrons, making them very unstable and ready to wreak havoc and cause cellular damage like a bowl in a china shop. So how exactly does our body make transition metals behave? And that's a great question because our bodies have systems in place. They what's called sequester. They lock in these metals such as iron into organometallic complexes. And organometallic complexes, it's a fancy word for a metal cage. This is when metallic ions, they tightly bind to organic molecules such as iron and connecting to hemoglobin to ensure that iron stays in place and that it does its job in managing oxygen or whatever function that particular metal has to offer. So what are some other ways that our cells protect the inner environment from chaos of metal ions? And the next one is, it's called complexation. So metal ions and water have a very complicated relationship. Complexation is when a ligand wraps around the metal ion to separate it from surrounding aqueous environment. They like to be together. They love to be together, but the relationship is really toxic. I like to mental model it as a therapist. The ligand is a marriage therapist creating a boundary, a healthy boundary. And so complexation is protective. Boundaries are protective, and we should all listen to the relational advice of these little ion friends. So metal ions, they can exist in different charge states, making them what's called multivalent. This means that they can donate electrons, called oxidation, and they can accept electrons, called reduction, to accommodate the different situations that they're placed in. I found this really neat picture. It's a little blurry, but I couldn't find one that wasn't. And this is really cool. And this is a mnemonic to help us remember oxidation versus reduction, which can be confusing. So oil rig, oxidation is to lose and reduction is to gain electrons. And so multivalency is particularly helpful within the electron transport chain as they pass electrons down through the redox process. It's similar to the wiring within a house and of getting energy from point A to point B. So the redox process is the movement of donating and accepting and donating and accepting electrons down this electron chain. So an example of a metal ion losing its neutral status would be ferrous iron, which has donated 2 of its electrons, or ferric iron, which has now lost 3 of its electrons. These little workers are essential in moving the electrons through our internal power stations. So aside from metal ions' ability to pass electrons to one another, these molecules are also helpful in acting as aprotic and protic acids. Aprotic acids are also known as Lewis acids, and they are molecules that accept electrons into empty valence orbitals, and they don't need the hydrogen ion because of that empty valence that can accept a lone pair of electrons. And another mental model I like to use is I like to picture an empty car space looking for an electronic car to house. And so that is the pair of electrons going to those empty valence orbitals. In contrast, protic acids, these are called Bronsted-Lowry acids, and they require a hydrogen ion so that they can donate that proton to a protic base. Do you remember that ferric ion that we mentioned earlier? That is a classic example of a Lewis acid. Okay, so now let's bring it back to the foods that we eat. We now know that we take on these micronutrients from foods and other consumption products, but how does it actually get to our bloodstream from the plate? And so micronutrients are largely absorbed through our gastrointestinal tract. What's interesting is that this means of absorption is actually very inefficient according to our text, and it is thought that this is on purpose. To help buffer and prevent excessive amounts of transition metals from overwhelming our biological systems. Now, many transition metals need to be oxidized and reduced during their journey of absorption. For instance, iron is absorbed in the ferric state, but then it's reduced to the ferrous state by the duodenal cytochrome B. It's also then transported to where it's needed in the body by by what's called divalent metal transporter 1. Copper is very similar to iron. It goes through the same redox phase before it's transported by copper transporter 1 to wherever that is needed. However, molybdenum is absorbed way more easily as it mimics structures such as phosphates and sulfates, and allowing it to hitch a ride like a hitchhiker using nonspecific anion transporters. So abnormal levels of any transition metal can cause disruption in metabolism and ultimately present as physiological conditions. For instance, a lack of iron can cause pernicious anemia. Copper can cause Men's disease, while molybdenum can cause sulfite oxidase deficiency. On the other hand, excessive amounts can cause further adverse effects. Excessive levels of gallium will displace iron, but gallium does not share the same multivalent capabilities that iron has, and so that further disrupts homeostasis. It disrupts the body, causes dysfunction, and ultimately leads to sickness. So here's a list of metals and their relative toxicities. On the non-toxic side, you have manganese and molybdenum, which I found interesting in the text to have manganese in the non-toxic area because it did cause some profound memory issues in my parents. But on the low side, you have gold and barium. Barium's interesting, used in a hospital setting for barium swallow tests. So patients under strict conditions do drink barium so that it acts as a contrast to X-rays. And medium to high, you'll have your chromium, cobalt, copper, nickel, and lead, mercury, all sorts. So at higher levels, these become more toxic. So thankfully for deficiencies, we have supplements, and for toxicities, we have medical interventions to treat the disturbances and bring our bodies back to that whole state. Some of these treatments for toxicities include what's called metal chelating agents. These agents, they bind to free-floating metals and they excrete them from the body. Another means is through hemodialysis, and this is a mechanical way to remove blood from your body, bypassing your kidneys, and then putting the clean blood back into your body. Generally used when your kidneys are shot and they're not working anymore. Another common treatment would be the use of diuretic medications. These are medications that kickstart and your kidneys into working harder to get fluid off of your body, and therefore the toxicity or the metal causing issues is secreted in that manner. Another treatment that needs to be paired with that is making sure that we're replacing your fluids intravenously and electrolytes to keep from abnormalities. So we're going to end here with 5 questions. Aprotic acids can accept lone pair blank on their empty valence orbitals. So aprotic acids can accept lone pair electrons on their empty valence orbitals. So they act as electron pair acceptors or Lewis acids without involving hydrogen ions. So metal ions need to be sequestered within what complexes to prevent harmful interactions within the surrounding environment? So if we remember that mental model of metal cages, we're looking at organometallic complexes to help keep everything in order. How much mass do transition metals take up within our bodies? So we know that we're not robots. We're not made entirely of metal, and that it's a really minute level. So the answer there is going to be less than 1%. Heavy metal toxicity can be treated through which of these treatments? And we discussed all of these. So hemodialysis, metal chelating agents, and diuretic medication. So it would be all the above, plus some. I mean, there are numerous different treatments based on the situation. It gets very complicated, but those are just 3 examples. And then molybdenum easily absorbs in the GI tract because it mimics what? Phosphates and sulfates, iron and copper are digestive enzymes. So molybdenum, it absorbs more easily as it mimics the same structures as phosphates and sulfates, allowing it to hitch a ride on their transporters, which is non-specific anion transporters. So in this lecture, we covered why essential transition metals are classified as micronutrients. We defined complexation and illustrated how the body uses molecules to safely sequester metal ions. We explored the role of multivalency in transition metals and broke down the fundamental differences between aprotic acids and protic acids. Biological multifunctional roles of metals was explained, followed by an explanation of the different gastrointestinal absorption pathways. Finally, we now understand the conditions that are caused from abnormal levels of transition metals and the clinical treatments necessary to make our bodies whole again. Transition metals play a vital role in the cellular respiration, the energy production, and the metabolism within our bodies. When strict regulation of these compounds, when they fail, abnormal levels cause physiological disorders and biological breakdown. So heavy metals can have life-threatening effects at toxic concentrations that require immediate medical intervention. Ultimately, having this clear understanding of the roles and the properties of these inorganic compounds provides a deep appreciation of the intricacies of human life. My name is William Holwick. with University of New England, and this was my final project. Thank you so much for listening to this video lecture.